testimony of her dedication to maritime law in Barbados. And the second individual, Madam President, is our Chief Fisheries Officer, Dr. Shelly-Ann Cox, extremely bright and passionate individual who, if you've ever met her, she eats, sleeps, and breathes fisheries. So I want to commend those two individuals for their work so far in the attempt to modernizing our maritime laws. Madam President, the bill addresses, yes, tangible and intangible, but I want to focus this afternoon on the intangible aspects of cultural heritage as it relates to the marine space. And I want to do so because usually it is such a hard concept to grasp, to manage, to qualify and quantify in a way that people can understand and we can make decisions about it, because you don't have a sense of what you're dealing with because of its intangible nature. And in addition to that, it deals with underwater heritage. Dare I ask how many honorable members in this chamber have gone underwater in Barbados? I'm seeing two, literally, more than 20 feet below sea level. It seems like there's a minority in the chamber. So these unseen things, Madam President, are also somewhat aloof to the average Barbadians because they don't know, they don't see, they don't interact with it. And because we don't interact with it, there is a tendency sometimes for it to go under the radar, and we don't value it as we should, as was recognized by the leader of government business in her presentation. But I also want to note that when we talk about the intangibles and cultural heritage and marine cultural heritage, in relation to sustainability, even globally, culture is an afterthought. Culture is an afterthought. And many persons who study, practice in the area are starting to recognize that we are failing in our attempt to arrest and address the global climate crisis is because what we're trying to change is not technology. What we're trying to change is not even the economic system. It is not how we deal with environmental issues. But what we're actually trying to change, or what has to change for all of those other things to get the results that we want, is culture. It is the value system that people have with the environment. And that is one of the hardest things to do in the current context of what we know as the capitalist society that drives a lot of the value system that we operate day in and day out with. And that is just a fact. That is just a fact, Madam President. It is such an afterthought in the discussion around culture, is such an afterthought, particularly in the maritime space, that even in Sustainable Development Goal number 14, Life Below Water, there's no mention of ocean culture. There's absolutely no mention of ocean culture. The Pacific Islands have done tremendous work in putting culture and sustainability on the table as it relates to ocean preservation and regeneration. And I want to say I commend Barbados for bringing this bill to the chamber this afternoon, because it sends a signal that in the Caribbean, we are prepared to be the thought leaders in this area of maritime heritage, Madam President. Ma'am, what I want to do is bring to the chamber's attention a document, and I'll make this a document of the House, is a thesis done by a master's student at the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies here in Barbados, CERMES. The author is Mr. Klish Gittins, who's a colleague of mine in the NGO space. And he did some seminal work in this area. I'm not sure if the government is even aware of this piece of research. But the title of the research was The Ocean and Our Culture, the characterization of the cultural benefits derived from the marine environment in Barbados using a cultural ecosystems services approach. And lo and behold, in that thesis, it found that in the coastal communities of Sixmens, Bats Rock, and Silver Sands, the coastal environment was instrumental and foundational to the cultural identity of both individuals and communities in those spaces. That type of research is directly related to the legislation that we are discussing today. In that study, it states it is evident that there's a dynamic relationship that occurs between people and the natural environment, which produces cultural benefits. Identity in each case study being the 3 research sites, is a central cultural benefit that is enabled, reinforced, or altered based on the practices that people engage in those areas. So there's a recognition, even in the research community, that there is a harmony that needs to occur between what is happening culturally and what is happening at the community level, as well as the environmental and the ecological systems. For us to get to the point where we can comfortably say we are moving in a sustainable, or we are moving towards a sustainable path. But I want to ask a question given what I've laid out already. Based on this current legislation, how does it pair with the physical development plan? How does this piece of legislation empower those communities or members of the community in an area like Sixmens in light of the development of the Pendry Hotel that is going to be their neighbor? How does this give life and breath to their rights as cultural practitioners, the holders of the untold stories, that intangible heritage of the Sixmens community, in light of how the development that is currently ongoing and any future development puts at risk that heritage? And that is the type of conversation that we have to have in relation to pieces of legislation like this. Because this is how this becomes real for people at the community level. I can ask another question. How does this legislation pair with the villa development at Joes River in St. Joseph? Given that there's clearly strong community connection to the area, and the development seems to be at odds with the cultural benefits that are derived in that community. So this piece of legislation has real implications for how we look at overall development, what weight we give to economic incentives and economic development, and what weight we give to preserving and conserving the values of communities, and what it intrinsically means to be Barbadian. And what does that look like, and how is that shaped in a 21st century context, where we, yes, need foreign investment, we need to service our debt, we need to do all these things to ensure our macroeconomic situation is stable, but at the same time ensure that we do not lose what it means to be Barbadian. And that is a constant tension as a small island developing state and what we now know, or what we call them now as large ocean states, have to contend with as we move forward in making decisions about our coastal and marine environment. Madam Deputy President, Madam President, today, I want to also highlight, based on those questions that I've raised, Clause 40 and Clause 232. Clause 40 speaks to the designation of community custodian. And the legislation reads, upon recommendation by the Chief Fisheries Officer, the minister responsible for coastal and marine affairs may, by order, designate a coastal community or fishing community as a community custodian. Clause 232, which is in Part 7, speaks to a citizens' impact and benefit sharing committee. So based on these two areas, I assume there is some recognition that in the governance framework, and I'm seeing nodding on the other side, in the governance framework, the need to have local community engagement in the decision-making about the development of our marine and coastal environment. And it is critical because those communities are the ones with the knowledge, the indigenous knowledge with the local knowledge. They are the ones who will deeply understand how any development that moves forward will impact the culture in that space. And what I will say and go even further with is that this Citizens Impact and Benefit Sharing Committee is not specified in terms of how members will be chosen, what type of decision-making power do they have, how are they integrated, for instance, into the PDP process, the physical development process and regulation. I think that needs to be addressed, fine-tuned, and articulated by the government, because having it in the legislation is a good start, but in order for those types of governance instruments at the local level to have teeth, we have to figure out the way by which we integrate them to give them legitimacy in the decision-making process. There have been calls about and I'm switching gears here. There have been calls as it relates to the damage that was done by the cruise ships during the pandemic to the coral reefs here in Barbados. That damage was just about the size of the Bridgetown area, the equivalent of it. I don't have the exact number, so I don't want to state right now the exact number. But the damage that was done was about the size of the Bridgetown area to the coral reefs. We come to this place to pass legislation so that it can be implemented and executed by the relevant agencies. There is legislation on the books that allows for compensation of the damage of reefs. However, I do not think to date that legislation has ever been used. I do not want to be a part of a legislature that passes laws for them to sit on shelves, for us to stand and pontificate about how lovely the legislation is. But then when it gets to the executing agencies, nothing is being done, because what we will be doing is wasting time. Madam President, I am saying this afternoon that, one, the damage that was done obviously the restoration or recovery could never have been started in a significant way because we all know that coral takes thousands of years to reproduce. And secondly, the people of Barbados were never compensated for that damage. If we are saying we're doing that for nature swaps, we are developing blue-green banks, we are establishing the marine spatial plan, we have to get serious about how we execute and implement ecological preservation and the penalties that go with anyone who commits an offense to our ecological assets. So, with those very short few words, Madam President, I commend this bill to the Chamber. It has my support. There are some other areas in here that I would ask some questions about later on in committee, and maybe I'll raise it now. The idea that any type of research done in a coastal community has to have the permit or be given a permit needs to be relooked. If a student at Barbados Community College goes into Skeets Bay and asks questions about anything related to the coastal environment, they may not know what are the implications set out in this legislation. But a fine of up to $100,000, we need to make sure that we are not conflating large research efforts or grants, which have millions of dollars associated with them, that may come from international agencies, and local researchers who are just doing their best to try to pass exams and get work done. I think there needs to be a distinction about what type of research we're targeting as it relates to the permits and how research is done in coastal communities. And that's something we can discuss in committee. But I wanted to flag that as an area that maybe more thought needs to go into it, because I would not want us to stifle research where every single individual who wants to do a piece of work or a piece of research or a study in a coastal community or the nearshore environment, for instance, has to go and get a permit. If they don't get the permit, they run contravention of the law. So that is an area I think we can have a further discussion about, but by and large, the piece of legislation that is before us, I think is commendable, and it really does start to bring to the fore how we deal with this tension of preserving community heritage, dealing with ecological integrity and preserving that as well, along with still achieving economic development. Madam President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator.
Madam President, I beg that this sitting of the Chamber of the House of the Chamber be suspended until 3:45. 2:45. 2:45. I thought it was being overly generous. the substantive leader of the House would have my head. Thank you.
She would be entirely breaking her practice. So the question is that the Senate be now suspended until 2:45 this afternoon. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it. The Senate is now suspended until 2:45.